everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer, and this is episode 15. My guest for this very special episode is Michael Colburn, currently the director of bands at Butler University, and formerly a member of the President's Own Marine Band for 27 years, including serving as the director from 2004 through 2014. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you for listening. Each week there are more of you tuning in, and that's awesome. Welcome to the community. While you're here, could you take a moment to go to iTunes and leave me a rating? This will help to spread the word about the show. If you find value from the show and want to help me keep the lights on, I've launched a Patreon page. Patreon is an online service that allows people to support creators in their work. You can find mine at patreon.com/Mark J. Connor. Now, on to the episode.
Good morning, Mark.
In the introduction, I mentioned your background, and I assume that most of my listeners know who you are, but would you take a moment to talk about yourself and give a little bit of your background?
Sure. I started out in music as a euphonium player, and as such, I really set my sights on hopefully getting a career in one of the military bands, especially the premier bands in Washington, D.C. I was fortunate enough to land in the Marine Band. I auditioned in 1986, came into the band in 1987. Spent 9 years as a player in the Marine Band. Was promoted to principal euphonium, spent 6 years in that position. In 1996, I was selected to become an assistant director in the Marine Band, served in that capacity for 8 years. And then, as you mentioned in your introduction, I served as the director of the President's Own from 2004 to 2014. After I retired from the band, I was appointed director of bands at Butler University, where I also teach conducting and euphonium.
How did you get started in music? Why the euphonium? What sort of started you down the path?
Sure. Well, my father was a high school band director, so I was surrounded with music from an early age, as long as I can remember. In fact, one of my earliest memories was sneaking into my big brother's bedroom. He's 10 years older than I am, and he was a tuba player and would sometimes have his sousaphone at home. And I still remember crawling underneath the horn, getting close enough to the mouthpiece to make a sound on the instrument, which was a pretty visceral memory. You know, creating that much sound as a little kid was pretty exciting. And so from an early age, I really wanted to play the tuba. When I hit fifth grade and it was time to pick out instruments, my father convinced me to start out on the baritone horn. He said, you believe me, you don't want to be lugging a tuba around at your age and your size. So why don't you start on the baritone, and then when you get a little bit bigger, you can switch to the tuba, which made a lot of sense. But I always kind of wondered if he had an ulterior motive because he didn't have enough euphonium players. I think he may have thought maybe he could get me hooked on the baritone at an early age. I did experiment with trombone and tuba in junior high. I was really fortunate in that my first band director was a bass trombone player, and so I had private lessons with him right from the get-go. And he gave me a chance to try all those instruments. And as much as I enjoyed playing trombone and tuba, there was something about the baritone, the euphonium, that really captivated me. I just loved the sound of the instrument. I was kind of intrigued by the fact that people didn't know what it was. I often had to kind of explain what the instrument was. So you get a little extra attention that way. And then when I was in, it was the summer between 8th grade and high school, I went to a band camp. Well, actually, it was a music camp at the University of Vermont. And one of the visiting clinicians was the principal euphonium in the Marine Band, a gentleman by the name of Lucas Spiros. And this was the first time I'd ever met a professional euphonium player, first time I'd ever seen one of these beautiful silver 4-valve compensating euphoniums. I was still playing a 3-valve con baritone horn, bell front baritone horn at the time, and was just blown away, both by Luke's playing and also by what a wonderful person he was. He was just really supportive, didn't make me feel like a loser for showing up with my little con baritone horn. And was very supportive. And it wasn't like it was a eureka moment where, on the spot, I decided I wanted to become a professional euphonium player. But that's really where the seed was planted that I could possibly do that for a living. So through high school, I had a lot of interest. I loved history. I was an athlete. I played basketball for a few years in high school. I had many, many interests. It wasn't like music was the only thing that really captivated me. But as I got older, I realized that seemed to be the thing that I did better than the other things that I loved. I would have loved to have been a professional basketball player, but I quickly realized I wasn't going to extend much beyond 6 feet. And as much as I loved basketball, I didn't really have skills that set me apart in basketball in the way that I seem to have in music. So I never really remember consciously deciding to go into music. It was just one of those things that seemed to kind of present itself to me, and that's kind of the way that I've lived my life, is that, it's important to have dreams and goals and a vision of who you want to be and what you want to do. But you've also got to kind of take assessments from time to time and ask yourself, what is it that you seem to be good at? And what is it, not to be too metaphysical about this, but what is it that it seems that you're supposed to do? And music really seemed like the thing that I was supposed to do. And of course, a big part of the reason for that was that I really enjoyed doing it. It wasn't just that I was good at it, but I loved making music. So I really set my sights on becoming a professional euphonium player. When I was in high school, I wrote to all the professional euphonium, all the principal players in the military bands in Washington, D.C., asking for recommendations of places to study, people to study with. And one of the names that showed up on everyone's list was Dan Parentoni, who was at that time the tuba euphonium teacher at the University of Illinois. So I auditioned for him and at a number of other schools. I was accepted at Illinois, but they didn't have any scholarship money available for me, and it was just too expensive for me. A little kid, a kid from the little state of Vermont, trying to figure out where to go study. That was just a place that was out of my reach. So I began college at the Crane School of Music in Potsdam, New York. It's part of the State University of New York system. Absolutely terrific music education school. I spent my freshman and sophomore year there, got a great grounding in music education, and started out as a music education major. But after I was there for a year, I was realizing that, I was really devoted to my music education studies. As I mentioned to you, my dad's a band director, and so I really believed in music education, but felt like it wasn't giving me enough time to practice my euphonium. And as much as I wanted to be a band director, my real passion, my real dream was to be a professional euphonium player. So I did something that I'm still not proud of to this day, and that is I changed my major from music education to music performance without telling my parents. And this was kind of a bold, risky, and really kind of a foolish move because, my dad wisely advised me that, look, I understand that you want to be a professional euphonium player, but that's kind of a long shot career and you need to be prepared, to do something else if that doesn't work out. So after I switched my major to performance, a couple of months later, my conscience was really just, killing me. So I called my dad and said, look, I've got to tell you, I did this. And, to his great credit, he was very understanding. And, my point to him was, I understand why you're advising me to do music education, but I'm really not finding enough time to practice. And I don't want to be looking at myself in the mirror when I'm 35, 40 years old, wondering, what if I had tried a little harder? Could I have made it? And so my promise to him was, if you allow me to do this, I'm going to give it a shot. And within a reasonable amount of time, if it hasn't worked out, I will go back and get certified, and I'll be the most dedicated band director you've ever met. And he understood what I was, what my point was, and allowed me to do this. And so at the same time, I found out that Dan Parentoni had changed schools. He was at Arizona State University. And so I auditioned for him again, and this time was fortunate enough to win a scholarship, full tuition scholarship to study with him at Arizona State. So I hopped on a plane for the very first time in my life. At that point, the farthest west I had been was Potsdam, New York, and flew out to Tempe, Arizona, which is basically a Phoenix suburb, to study at Arizona State University. And when I stepped off that plane on the tarmac in August in Tempe, when the temperature was about 115, and the airport was surrounded with all these red rocks, I felt like I'd stepped onto another planet, and really the musical experience at ASU studying with Dan was almost like being in another world as well. I went from a place where there were a couple of euphonium majors to a place where there were 12 euphonium majors. And I was suddenly very much in the deep end of the pool, but it was the best decision I could have made. The opportunity to study with Dan was really life-changing. He totally changed me as a player and as a musician. And I'm firmly convinced that I never would have had a career in the Marine Band had it not been for my studies with him. And of course, the ensembles at ASU were fantastic as well. So it was really the right move for me. And then I auditioned for the Marine Band, and as I said, 1986, December of 1986. That was actually the very first military band audition that occurred during my 3 years of study with Dan at Arizona State. That's, of course, one of the riskier things about a career in performance is that you just don't know when those auditions are going to happen. And so I was very fortunate that audition came along in December of 1986. So at that audition, they were looking for 2 euphonium players, and I came in third. So I really very much thought at the moment, okay, that may have been my only opportunity to win a position with one of the military bands. I better start thinking about Plan B, thinking about that conversation with my father so many years earlier. But a couple of months later, I got a call from the Marine Band, and they mentioned that they decided to add another position to the band and wanted to know if I was still interested. So as you might imagine, I was a little more than a little excited, and took very little time in responding positively to that invitation. Joined the Marine Band as a euphonium player, as I mentioned, sitting third chair in the section. And it really was everything I could have hoped for. It was just a fantastic opportunity. I learned more in my first 6 months in the band about playing euphonium in an ensemble that I had in my entire Marine Corps, or my entire music education previously. That's how I ended up in the Marine Band. As I mentioned, I was promoted to principal euphonium within a couple of years after joining the band. Played many solos, was featured as a tour soloist many times, had the opportunity to make a solo recording when I was in the band, which is still available commercially, and something I'm very proud of, especially since my career took off in a very different direction after I joined the band. I'm sorry, I'm getting a call here.
That's okay.
Decline that. So I'm sorry, I've been talking here a long time. Do you want me to go into how I ended up becoming a conductor, or do you want to jump in with some other questions at this point?
I kind of want to dig in a little bit. We'll come back to the story of how you became a conductor, but I want to talk about that switch. Sure. Now that you're at Butler and you're kind of on the other end of it. Mm-hmm. Do you think you'd advise students to make the same decision, switch to performance out of education?
That's a great question. I'm now suddenly on the other end of this equation, where I'm giving advice to students and their parents about, making these kinds of decisions. And many times actually recommend to students that they do get a degree in music education, but the key there is that they want to be music educators. What I really don't like to see is people who really want to perform and who become really kind of grudging, come into music education grudgingly.
Yeah.
You have to have a passion for it. And as I said, when I made my decision all those years ago, I was really torn because I love the idea of being a music educator. That's really what I'm doing now, and I'm every bit as passionate about what I'm doing now as playing the euphonium. But at the time, I also knew that I felt like I was kind of behind my peers in terms of my development as a player, and that if I was really going to give that opportunity all the effort that I thought was required, I needed to kind of pare down the distractions. But when I'm talking to students who are coming to Butler, if they have a strong interest in education and performance, one of the things I point out to them is that we have a combined performance and music education program. It requires an extra year of study, but I think it's really a great way to satisfy both of those needs and those urges, But I do point out as well that if what you really want to do is perform, then I certainly understand that desire to get a performance degree. You just need to understand that it guarantees you nothing. And this is one of those conversations that I have, and I'm very frank and honest that, when I've got euphonium players that come to study with me, I tell them, what I can guarantee you is that I can make you a better euphonium player. What I can't guarantee you is a career as a performer. And you need to go into this with open eyes and understand that, yes, I can equip you to be as well equipped for a euphonium audition for a military band audition as you can possibly be. But I can't guarantee that you're going to win, because even back when I was auditioning for the military bands, I had many friends that I felt like were certainly as good or better players than I was, who never got the job, who never scored the gig, So there are no guarantees when you want a career in performance. And it's also not to say that the only opportunity in performance is with one of the military bands. I just returned a couple of weeks ago I was at a International Euphonium Tuba Festival that's organized by Adam Fry, who's based out of Georgia. And Adam has carved out a career for himself as a soloist, as an educator, that is really unlike any other. He's really blazed a trail and demonstrated that you don't have to go the military band route to have success as a performer and as an educator. So. And honestly, I think in this day and age, as we see musical careers evolve, I think more and more musicians are going to have to be entrepreneurial. They're going to have to be creative, and especially if they want careers as performers, they may need to piece a career together that involves performing in a number of different ensembles, that involves having a private studio, that involves creating organizations and ensembles that didn't exist beforehand. It's really going to require a lot of creative energy and, as I said, that kind of entrepreneurial spirit.
Has the evolution of the sort of the college degrees for music majors, it seems like these days the real performance degree is the Masters of Music. It seems like that's where performers are made these days.
That while that is true, it's hard to project exactly when a player is really going to mature, when they're really going to take off. And, with the Marine Band, for our auditions, the only thing that is required is that you are a U.S. citizen and 18 years of age. And we have had players that have auditioned with master's degrees and doctoral degrees, and on paper look like the most amazing players you've ever met, who have been beaten by a freshman in college at an audition. And for us, our bottom line is we want to find the best musician that we can find. And we certainly hope that that we're going to find someone who has completed their education, or is at least, if not at their terminal degree, achieved some kind of a degree that does feel like they've completed an education. But again, it's hard to predict exactly when those players are going to mature, and you see this in the orchestral world as well. The Indianapolis Symphony just hired a bass trombone player who was 19 years old, So I would agree that more and more, and I think that idea of getting an undergraduate degree in music education or in the liberal arts, and then refining your interest at the master's or doctoral level, whether that's performance or some other kind of specialization, that certainly follows the kind of the recommended path of liberal arts study. But every student is different, and I think that's where we as advisors need to be sensitive to that as well. And of course, involving mom and dad in the discussion too, especially when mom and dad's funds are being used for that education.
Sure. I'm fascinated listening to musicians who have served in the military bands and listening to their stories. Everyone's very different, and everyone has a very different experience with their time in the military bands. Do you have any advice for teachers of students, or maybe the students directly, who might want to audition for one of the bands, what to expect, and what they need to know before they go into that?
Sure. Well, musically, the auditions, especially for the premier bands, are going to be very similar to what you're going to find at professional symphony orchestras. I know in the Marine Band, we model our auditions very much on what you would have to do for the New York Philharmonic or the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Lots of orchestral and, of course, in our case, band excerpts. Some solo playing as well, but of course, one of the things we're looking for is someone who plays well in an ensemble, who's not just a soloist. So I think it's important, when you're preparing those excerpts, that you are preparing them in the way that you would play them in an ensemble. I know that we, and talking to our friends in the orchestral world, when we hear somebody play an excerpt, we want to hear evidence that how your part fits in the larger picture. We want to, we can tell if it sounds like you've just prepared this all by yourself in a practice room without ever listening to a recording or ever performing this piece with an ensemble. And so it's really important as you're playing those excerpts to imagine as much as possible in your own mind that rest of that orchestra or that band around you as you're playing. So to have that kind of ensemble awareness when you're preparing those excerpts. And of course, just being as prepared as possible. I've had so many people come up to me afterwards and ask, so what were you looking for in that audition? And in a way that kind of suggests that there's some kind of magic answer, some magic combination of interpretation and other issues that are somehow elusive. And I'll tell you, for 90% of our auditionees, it's the basics that weed them out. It's a lack of good rhythm, good tone, good intonation, and really attention to detail in the excerpts. I don't think a lot of times players are aware of how far off the mark they are. And I think the critical thing there is to do as much listening, to record yourself and compare that to, the very best recordings that you can find, and just, come up with an inventory of where you're missing the mark. That's really critical. But the other aspect of military band auditions that I think people need to remember is that there are other things that can keep you from getting the job. You need to meet the weight requirements. That's something that a lot of players don't really want to think about before they join the military. But if you are, 20, 30, 40 pounds over the weight limit when you come into audition, you may not even be allowed to audition. You certainly will not be allowed to be hired. And so I've met some players who've kind of put that off, and I think it's really a shame. You have to be enlistable in that service. It's important that you, if you are interested in these kind of careers, to contact these organizations and find out if they can give you a list of things that may be medical disqualifications. Sometimes we can get these things waived. If it's a mild case of asthma, for example, we can often get those things waived. But there are other medical issues that can't be waived, and it's really heartbreaking to me when I meet a young person who has spent years preparing for one of these auditions and has never bothered to find out whether or not there might be some other aspect of their background that might disqualify them. And in the case of the Marine Band, you also need a White House security clearance, which means they're going to do a background check. And so if there's been any kind of financial impropriety, if you've defaulted on a student loan, that alone, if you've had some kind of gambling debt or something like that, can immediately disqualify you as well. Of course, drug use is another thing that is, unfortunately has been an issue that has knocked a few people out of consideration, at Marine Band auditions. And it's heartbreaking. You find this person who's musically won the audition and then has this other issue in their background that disqualifies them from consideration. It's really just heartbreaking. So it's important, if you really do aspire to one of these military band auditions, you can reach out. These organizations are really great. You can find their website, contact somebody from the administrative side of the organization who can get back to you with some general guidance, or if you have a specific question, they can probably answer that as well.
There's just so much that goes into this. I just watched a movie. I went to a screening last night of a new documentary called Composed, which is about auditions and performance anxiety. One of the things that was brought up by the musicians who were interviewed, and these were the world-class musicians from orchestras around the country and the world, is that auditions, oftentimes people forget to be musical. They get so caught up in making sure that everything is absolutely spot on that they forget to play music.
Right.
And it can overwhelm them.
Yeah.
You talked about auditions. Are they blind auditions for the Marine Band?
Yeah, they're blind for the preliminary round, and then we usually take the screen down for the final round unless there's some reason that we need to keep it up. For example, if it's a family member of somebody in the band or something like that, that could potentially, affect the decision. But at some point, because of the nature of our organization, we do need to lay eyes on the auditionees. But that preliminary round is behind a screen, and we totally understand and believe in the importance of that. But to get back to your point about musicianship, yes, you don't want to go into the audition with the mentality that I don't want to screw up.
Yeah.
I think of that old Gary Larson cartoon of, I think it's Harold the cymbal player, who's saying to himself, I'm not going to screw up. I'm not going to screw up. And you see that he's holding only one cymbal, right?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes when you go into an audition, if that's all you're thinking is I don't want to miss a note, then you are going to play stiff and unmusically.
Right.
And I also think, again, I get back to, the conversations I've had with people after an audition who are convinced in some cases that it's because they missed that high B flat. That's the reason they didn't win the audition. And a missed note, an incidental mistake like that is something that is not going to concern the committee at all. The kind of mistakes that are going to concern the committee are those mistakes that reveal a lack of preparation and a lack of attention to detail. Yes, you have to play with good pitch, good rhythm, good tone quality that will match the ensemble. These are all things that come into play. But so often I found with players that they get focused on the wrong thing. And when it comes to playing musically, again, I think the key there is when you study that excerpt, listen to as many recordings as you can. If you can play that piece in an ensemble, do that. And then, as much as possible, place yourself mentally in that same space as you would when you're playing all by yourself behind a screen, which of course, I mean, that's the really challenging thing about auditions, is that it's the most artificial and intimidating environment in which to make music you can imagine. And it bears such little resemblance to what you do in an ensemble. And yet we in the committee have to try to discern from what you're doing in this very artificial environment how well you're going to match the organization. And that's why, for our final rounds, we will often have the candidate play either a duet or, as part of a small ensemble, for our string auditions, they always sit in with a string quartet in the final round. So we can find out how well they do match others, how well they blend, how quickly they react, and adjust their own playing to match what's going on around them. Because that is perhaps the most critical ensemble skill, of course, is that ability to listen and adjust on the fly.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we talk a little bit about the nature of what that was like to play in the White House, to be the band that represents the United States?
Sure.
I mean, that's something for me. I actually probably saw you play when I was in college. You came through the university I was studying at. And the Marine Band to me was always the ideal. And so I think a lot of listeners might be interested to know what that's like to do that.
I kind of approach it from a couple of different angles. The first, you talk about our role at the White House. So just historically, the band is unique, and unique is probably not even a strong enough word, because we're the only band to be founded by an act of Congress. We've been around since 1798. So we have played for every president except for George Washington. Many times I wish I could hop in a time machine and go back and play for Washington so we could say we hit every single one. But still, that's a pretty good stretch. We played for every inauguration since Thomas Jefferson's first inauguration in 1801. And so when we're playing events around town, when I was first playing inaugurations and conducting inaugurations, and I would think about all the Marine Band members that had gone before me and done exactly the same thing, it makes you realize that you're part of this continuum, and the history that the Marine Band has witnessed. The Marine Band was on the train that carried Abraham Lincoln to Gettysburg for the Gettysburg Address. We were there for that event.
Wow.
And then you start realizing, like all of the monuments in Washington, D.C., the Marine Band played for the dedication ceremonies for all of those monuments. And so now we're at the point where we're playing the anniversaries. And, speaking of Gettysburg, I was the conductor of the Marine Band when we did the 150th anniversary of the dedication of Gettysburg National Cemetery. And
wow.
At that event, a member of the audience came up and introduced himself to me, an older gentleman, and he said that he was a former member of the Marine Band that was there when the Marine Band played the 100th anniversary.
Oh, my goodness.
In 1963. But hold on a second. So he's telling me that, and then he mentions that Kennedy, of course, was president at the time and came up to the band, and that time of the year is right after the Marine Band returns from our national concert tour. And so the band is usually on a couple of weeks of leave to make up for all the time we've been on the road. But because of this event, the band was called back early to play the event. And so President Kennedy came up to the band and said, "Hey guys, I know the only reason you're here is because I'm here. I'm so sorry that we had to cut into your leave. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll see you next week when I get back from Dallas." Well, of course, that next week was when he was assassinated in Dallas. But just thinking of all of these historical loops, this gentleman who had been in the Marine Band telling me that they had been there at the 100th anniversary, and that Kennedy had come up to them and talked to them right before he went to Dallas and was assassinated. I mean, you just start feeling like you are, like I said, you're part of this continuum, but within this continuum, there are all of these loops that keep doubling back on themselves, and it really is incredible. And the chance to make music at the White House, I'll tell you, every time I walked in there, right up to the end of my career, I got butterflies. Just the chance to make music in that space, not just for the president, but for all of these people. The people that you see at the White House, you just never know who's going to be there. I remember one time doing conducting the theme from Schindler's List, and I hear this smattering of applause after we finished, and I turned around and it was John Williams and Steven Spielberg who had been in the receiving line, and were so flattered that they came out to listen to the group. One of my first times conducting at the White House, I was doing the this is with our chamber orchestra. This is back in 1996, and I was doing Ray Vaughan Williams' English Folk Song Suite, and I felt a tug on my elbow, and I assumed it was a member of the staff, and I turned around, and it was President Bill Clinton himself, who again had come out of this reception and said to me, "Oh, this is the English Folk Song Suite. This is one of my favorite pieces of music, and now the first movement is 17 Come Sunday, but the next movement is My Bonnie Boy, and the band version, the oboe has the violin, but in the orchestra version, is it the violin?" And he wanted to talk shop, and meanwhile, I'm a brand new conductor, my first time conducting at the White House. I'm trying not to screw up as I'm talking shop with the president,
Uh-huh.
And that event was really meaningful for me, of course, my first time conducting there at the White House, but also for our band members, because when we're there playing at a social function at the White House, we're like musical wallpaper. We're not the main attraction,
Mm-hmm.
And so people are kind of milling around and talking, and it's easy to start thinking that nobody's really listening to you. But then to hear that not only is somebody listening to you, but it happens to be the President of the United States, or we're playing Schindler's List and thinking, who's really listening? Oh, guess what? Steven Spielberg and John Williams just happen to be in the other room listening to this, So it reminds us that even when we're playing background music, and it's easy to start thinking that people aren't really paying attention, you never know who's listening. And I think that's just such a great lesson in life in general. I remember working with Arnold Jacobs. He came and worked with the Marine Band back in the former principal tuba with the Chicago Symphony, and a great brass pedagogue. And he came in to work with the Marine Band back in the 90s. And I remember him telling a story of being a young student at Curtis. And at the time, Fritz Reiner, who later would become this really tyrannical conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, was just known for being, a real stern taskmaster. Fritz Reiner was then the orchestra director at Curtis, and he was known to wander the halls of Curtis late at night and wander by the practice rooms to hear what the students were doing. And so Arnold Jacobs, as a young tuba player, imagined that Fritz Reiner was always outside of his door, always, whenever he was playing, and made sure that whatever sound was coming out of his tuba would be acceptable to Fritz Reiner. And I thought, boy, what a great lesson in life, for those musicians who spend hours in a practice room and kind of mentally check out and zone out and really just don't consider every note to come out of their instrument to be as important as when they're on stage, playing for somebody like Fritz Reiner. But to hear Jacobs, say that was his mindset, I thought, boy, what a great lesson for all of us.
Yeah, what's the saying? Practice like your life depends on it. Perform like it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
What's sort of the I'm always confused by like what the different missions of the Washington bands or the premier bands are.
Sure. Every band has got its own mission and kind of general character that results from that. In the Marine Band, our mission is to provide music for the White House. We are the only band in town for whom, it's specified in our mission. Now, that's not to say the other bands don't play at the White House. They certainly do. But for us, that is our specific mission. And so that means generally, especially for things that happen inside the White House, state dinners, other social functions, we get contacted by the White House Military Office. And in fact, the director of the band is the music advisor to the White House, which means that he or she liaisons with the social secretary to determine what musical support is required for different events. Now, that's not to say the only thing we do is to play at the White House. Of course, we also have a part of our mission is to provide music for the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And so we play ceremonies, we play full honor funerals at Arlington National Cemetery. We do other events around town. And of course, we do public concerts as well. The other bands have slightly different missions. The Old Guard, they are specifically a ceremonial unit. So most of what they do are ceremonies, mostly within what we call the Military District of Washington, the greater Washington area. But they are occasionally tasked to do ceremonies elsewhere in the country as well. Occasionally, those musicians may be required to do some other things, but their mission is very specific in doing those ceremonies. With the Marine Band, our philosophy is a little different. Some of the bands in town will have a dedicated concert band, a dedicated ceremonial band, a dedicated jazz band. Some of the bands in town have a chorus, this kind of thing. With the Marine Band, our philosophy more closely mirrors what the Marine Corps does, where we kind of move the pieces around as required by commitment. So we've got 154 members in the organization. Of that number, about 130 are performing members. 18 are string players, and the remainder are winds, brass, and percussion. And of course, we have some keyboard players as well. And so we really mix and match our players. One week they may be, playing a concert with a concert band. The next week they may be playing in our chamber orchestra at the White House. We occasionally will get requests from the White House for things like a mariachi band or an Irish ensemble. We got a request once for a klezmer ensemble, and much to my pleasant surprise, we had some clarinet players that specialized in that kind of playing. So you just never know what is going to be required. And so our players are very versatile. We've got a country band that in which one of our lead singers is one of our French horn players. If we advertised for a French horn player that could also sing, country music, we'd be hard pressed to find somebody who could win that audition. But after our players come into the band, if they find out there is a need that the organization has for one of these kind of specialty ensembles, and it's something that they can do, they're very generous about sharing their talent. And so that's really neat to see. But back to your original question, each one of the bands has a slightly different mission. And so the kind of music that they play and kind of their general character is often defined by that. For example, the Army Field Band is designed to tour, and they tour more than any other military band in the armed services. They spend, I think, somewhere between 4 and 5 months every year on the road. But Pershing's Own is not tasked to tour, and so occasionally they'll do run-out concerts, but most of the work that they do is right there in Washington, D.C. So it really just depends on the organization.
Right. Now, for the Marine Band, when you audition for the Marine Band, you're in the Marine Band. You're not moved around.
Yep. So when we have an opening, we audition just like a symphony orchestra would. We get anywhere from 50 to 125 people who will show up for one of our auditions. So the preliminary round is pretty quick, as you might imagine, because we have to get through so many people. It is behind a screen, as we talked about earlier. And then if you win the audition, of course, you have to be enlistable in the Marine Corps and also get a White House security clearance. And so if you satisfy all those requirements, you are enlisted in the band, and you report for duty directly to Washington, D.C. We do not send our Marines to recruit training at Parris Island or San Diego. And that is because, as you mentioned, if you win a position with a Marine Band, you can't be transferred anywhere else in the Marine Corps. So I spent 27 years right there in Washington, D.C. with the President's Own. Your only responsibility for the Marine Corps is musical. So that's the reason our Marines aren't sent to Parris Island and San Diego, where, of course, recruit training involves weapons training and a training in other skills that you would need in combat situations that our Marines would never find themselves in. So if you win a position with a band, you come directly to D.C., and then you receive 4 to 6 weeks of military training from one of our drum majors who has been to recruit training and is able to train our Marines in the customs and courtesies, the rules and regulations that are required, because they do come into the band as staff sergeants at the enlisted rank of E6. And as far as the Marine Corps is concerned, they are Marines. And so they need to know, again, the rules and regulations, the customs and courtesies, everything else that any other Marine would know. They receive their training in right there at Marine Barracks 8th and I. And then after they've gone through that, that's when they can start playing their instruments with the band.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting Dwayne. I have no doubt that he's a Marine.
Yeah, Dwayne King you're talking about?
yeah, Dwayne. And, really nice, but
he's... what a tall drink of water, huh? I mean,
he is very tall and intimidating.
Very imposing presence. He's like your like prototypical Marine Band drum major right there, I'll tell you. Yeah, and a great guy, super nice guy.
He is. He was very nice. All right, Mike, I really appreciate all the insight into the Marines, but I want to give you a chance to talk about Butler. And what's your program look like? What have you got going now?
Yeah, well, as I said, I'm the director of bands at Butler. I'm going to back up just a step, Mark.
Sure.
I haven't really talked about how I ended up becoming a conductor. And that kind of segues into what I do here at Butler. So I'd been playing in the band for several years, but I started working on a master's degree in conducting at George Mason University because I wanted to make myself as prepared as possible if I did want to pursue a college career. I knew that no college would hire me just to teach euphonium, so I needed a different skill set. And so I thought, well, why not conducting? I knew the conducting teacher, Tony Maiello, at George Mason, and so I contacted him, and he took me into his studio. But it was very much kind of a secondary skill set that I was looking to develop because I really viewed myself as a euphonium player. And as part of my degree program at George Mason, I started conducting on our chamber series in the Marine Band, and conducted Stravinsky's Histoire du Soldat as part of my my final recital requirement. And Tim Foley, who was then an assistant director in the Marine Band, pulled me aside and said, "Hey, we kind of like what we're seeing here. Have you ever thought about conducting in the Marine Band?" And you could have knocked me over with a feather because I thought, I'm a euphonium player. I'm not a conductor, you know. But as the more I talked to Tim and realized that this was an opportunity not only to become a conductor, but to become a leader in the organization, to be involved in the kind of direction and shaping of the future of the organization, that I found to be just too tempting to resist. So I did set my euphonium down in 1996, picked up a baton, and became a conductor in the Marine Band. And really, one of the big attractions to that possibility was the chance to work with Tim. He's just an absolutely phenomenal musician, a great leader. There's another person involved in the leadership of the band at the time named Frank Byrne, who's now the executive director of the Kansas City Symphony, who again is just a brilliant person, fantastic musician, and a really inspirational person. So Tim and Frank and I were very close, and the chance to work with those two guys was incredible. So I became a conductor, and I like to tell this story to, especially to young musicians, and this harkens back to what we were talking about earlier in our conversation about, having a goal, having a vision about what you want to do with your life. But as I point out to young people, you may not even be aware of all the possibilities that are out there at this point. And while it's important to pursue those goals with every ounce of energy and intensity you've got, don't rule out other options that may come along that you don't even know about at this point. And for me, that was conducting. I thought, I'm really a euphonium player, and conducting just opened up a whole new world of possibilities for me. And as much as I still love playing my euphonium, the chance to lead an ensemble and now to teach students has been absolutely fantastic. So as I approached the end of my career in the Marine Band, I found out about this opening at Butler. So I had a friend here, and I contacted him, and they said, well, why don't you come out here? Because at that point, I knew nothing about Butler. My wife and I are both from a very small town in northern Vermont, and so the Midwest was a great unknown to us. And so we came out to Indianapolis and spent about a week on campus. They had me conduct the wind ensemble and teach some classes. I think part of it was that they knew that I was a Marine Corps colonel and had come from the Marine Band, and I think they were afraid I was going to make kids do push-ups when they missed notes, because they just had this kind of stereotypical idea of what a Marine Corps colonel would be like. And so
that would have been funny.
Yes, but I don't think I would have gotten hired had I done that.
Perhaps not.
So I think when they saw that I spoke the same language they were used to hearing, and that I was really much more familiar than they might have suspected, they offered me the job, and we were thrilled with Butler. My wife and I both fell in love with the place as soon as we arrived here. Not just the school, but the city and just this whole environment. We live about a block from campus, so I can walk or ride my bike to school every day, which after commuting in Washington, D.C. for 27 years is a welcome change, I can assure you. But the students, I really, I'd given some thought to where I wanted to end up after my Marine Corps career. And ideally, I envisioned myself at kind of a mid-sized school. I didn't really want to go to a huge system and a big city with all the kind of intensity that goes with that. I had more than enough intensity with my Marine Band career, and I was ready for something a little quieter. And I'd always kind of liked the idea of being at a smaller school where hopefully I could really make a difference for these young music students. And that's definitely what I found here at Butler. The school's about 4,400 students, have about 180 students in our School of Music. It's a school that I could tell as soon as I stepped on campus is in kind of a mode of growth. Our university president is very visionary. There's a lot of building happening on campus, and so my feeling in coming to Butler was the hope that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that's certainly what I found in my 3 years here at Butler. The program is growing. And there's been a lot of excitement from the students about me being here. It was a bit of a transition, as you might imagine, going from working with professional musicians to working with student musicians. But one of the very first day that I was working with the wind ensemble, one of my first statements to them was, look, you need to understand that I don't ever expect that you're going to sound like the Marine Band, because that would be unfair to you and unfair to me. What I hope we can do is to grow and to develop. But even during my time with the Marine Band, I'd done a lot of guest conducting with high school groups, all state festivals, this kind of thing. And so I was used to making music on a different level than I had with the Marine Band. And for me, the satisfaction that you can derive from making music comes from not necessarily how high the final product is, but how much development and growth occurred from that first rehearsal until the concert. How much could we make this sound better? And of course, one of the things that I hope to impart to the students here at Butler is the things that I learned during my time with the Marine Band, that I learned from those incredible musicians from the Marine Band. And one of the things that I learned and developed was a very kind of collaborative approach to making music. When I was leading those musicians in the Marine Band, I really felt more like kind of a coach in a large chamber ensemble than any kind of a dictatorial conductor. I didn't really feel like those players were playing for me. I felt like we were making music together, and that's very much the approach that I've brought to Butler. And I've been really, pleasantly surprised at how easy the transition has been. How many of the skills that I developed with the Marine Band I've been able to bring to Butler. Certainly modify it a little bit, and adjust a little bit, but to rely on those students to bring a musical message to every rehearsal, and for them to understand that I'm interested to hear what they are bringing to the table, and that ideally that musical process should be a collaborative one, where the conductors and the players are working together to kind of shape an interpretation that really makes the most sense given the players that we have in that group. My interpretation of any piece of music, I just did Lincoln Tripozzi last year with the Butler Wind Ensemble. And what I did interpretively was a little different than what I might have done with the Marine Band, but it was shaped in part by the musicianship and the musical personalities, really, of the players that I was dealing with. And to me, that's really one of the fascinating things about making music, is that every moment, even when I was with the Marine Band, I would do a Sousa March, night after night after night on tour. And every night, the tempo might be slightly different given the context of the space that we were playing in, just the biorhythms of the band on a given night. It's, music and musical interpretation should be a living, breathing organism, and it shouldn't be exactly the same every night, or my gosh, how boring would that be, right? If there's only one specific, hard and fast interpretation of a piece of music, why would we keep doing that? So I've really had a great time here at Butler, not only conducting the wind ensemble, but I've been teaching conducting, and so the chance to do that for the very first time in my career has been really exciting. And to get back into the euphonium a little bit. I had to kind of set my euphonium down for many years while I was conducting in the Marine Band, and Butler was open to the possibility of me teaching euphonium here. So it's been really fun for me to dip my toe back into those waters as well.
You mentioned about how every piece is different, but it's still the same idea with no matter the level of the ensemble. I kind of want to talk a little bit about nuts and bolts. How do you introduce a piece? What are your priorities when you're first teaching a piece of music to your ensembles?
When I'm first teaching a piece to my ensembles, my approach is a little different here than it would be in a professional environment, where you've got a limited amount of time. You want to use that time as efficiently as possible. You're also understanding that your musicians are going to have a deeper wealth of knowledge about this music than students in a college environment are going to have. So when I come in for that first rehearsal, one of the first things I do is to provide some background. Give them some idea of where this piece comes from, both in terms of historical context broadly, but even within the composer's output. Any kind of important background information that's going to help them understand this piece of music. And often I'll start by playing a recording, a very fine interpretation, just as a model for us to aspire to. Not that we're going to try to copy any particular interpretation or recording exactly, but just to kind of get that sound in their ear of how this music should sound in an ideal kind of situation. Then when we initially read the piece, I'll certainly back some of the tempos down a bit, but I try to make sure that the initial tempos closely enough resemble the final tempo to give them some idea of what to expect in the piece. But to work in kind of broad strokes initially. When the first time through the piece, let's get an idea of what this whole piece is about before we roll up our sleeves. I think if you just dive in, working on the technical details, just slowing everything down, if you do that right off the bat, you're missing the chance to kind of plant the seeds, that will grow into the fruit of this fully formed interpretation. So again, to work in broad strokes initially, but then, okay, now let's slow things down. Now let's tear things apart. Let's rebuild that. And that seems to work pretty well, to give the players the kind of general idea of what the piece is all about before we get too specific really seems to work pretty well.
Yeah. And as a teaching conducting for the first time, what's been insightful about that? Have you learned anything about conducting from that experience?
I feel like anytime you're teaching, whether it's on your instrument or conducting, it's a chance to examine yourself. I talked about linkage poesy. That's often a piece that I use for study with our advanced conducting students. I in addition to teaching in classes, I do individual lessons as well. And I laugh because every time I go through that score, I will find something else that I've either missed or forgotten. Every single time, as I'm pouring over this music with these students, I think, oh, look at that little detail. I'd totally forgotten that he did that there, and I think the study of, as I said, whether it's your instrument or conducting, it's a chance to re-examine yourself and your own approach. I tell my conducting students, anytime you play in an ensemble, it's an opportunity to study conducting because you're looking at this conductor, right? And you can just think about it in terms of your own part, but if you do that, you're missing this opportunity. But every decision that conductor makes, turn that around and ask yourself, how would I handle that? How would I manage that transition? How would I set that tempo? What would I do differently? But I think, and this is just true of life in general, that if we just kind of go through, unthinkingly executing our responsibility without really thinking about how it fits in the big picture, we're really missing an opportunity to grow and develop as musicians. But whether you're sitting in that ensemble or standing on that podium or even sitting in an audience, be actively engaged in your listening. Think about, again, ask yourself those questions. How closely did that conductor, interpret the composer's intent? Some composers are very specific about how they want their music to go. How accurately did that conductor do that? And if he or she made different decisions, how well did they justify that? Was that interpretation, did it feel right? Did it make sense? Because of course we know you don't always have to, strictly adhere to the composer's intent. But I always tell my conductors, if you're gonna differ from that, you better have a good reason for it. You better be able to sell that interpretation. Bernstein is a perfect example of someone who often departed from what the composer indicated in the score. But he was so effective at selling his interpretations that I think most people either didn't know or didn't care. Oftentimes with a Bernstein interpretation, it's not till I sit down with the score and really study it carefully, I think, whoa, man, did he have a lot of, cojones to do that? But he was so effective at selling his interpretations that I think most people bought it.
Yeah, we're entering the home stretch, but you brought up composers, and of course in the band world, most of us are living.
Sure.
And around, do you have much experience working with composers in recent years, maybe at Butler?
I've worked actually with one of the things that I really tried to champion when I was with the Marine Band was commissioning works from, of course, living composers. You can't really commission works from a non-living composer. But I tried to really focus on composers who hadn't yet worked with bands, trying to kind of, broaden our scope. There's a little bit of a pattern in the band world of a composer to suddenly become very popular, and then suddenly everyone else is clamoring to commission another piece from that same composer. And so one of my goals was to try to find other composers like David Rakowski, Melinda Wagner, David Chaikin, other orchestral, and this follows actually this overlaps with the work that Tim Foley was doing. In fact, David Chaikin first worked with us. I ended up premiering the work, but it was commissioned when Tim was still director. But David Rakowski is another example. Melinda Wagner, who won the Pulitzer Prize for her flute concerto. And finding other composers who had not yet delved into the band world. But we certainly, I've worked closely with Stephen Bryant and John Mackey. We had John Corigliano come in when we had Leonard Slacken serve as a guest conductor with the Marine Band. So we have worked with a number of very successful, band composers, and it's always gratifying. It's always a great experience to work with those composers. In fact, we're part of a consortium right now that has commissioned Stacy Garrup to write a new sax concerto that is going to be played by one of our faculty sax players. And Stacy is a composer that I've worked with on a number of committees closely over the years, and I'm really excited about working with her on this project. Jennifer Higdon's another one. In fact, we had Evelyn Glennie come in and play Jennifer Higdon's percussion concerto, which was originally written for orchestra, but Jennifer agreed to transcribe her work for the Marine Band for one of our soloists back when I was director. And it's always so great to work with these composers, especially if you could have them come in and be around for rehearsals, around for recordings, to get their input. And for us to be able to provide feedback to them too about things that maybe didn't work quite as well as they could have, the way things are written for certain instruments. Getting feedback from the musicians about that, I think, is really valuable for young composers especially. So yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I try to make sure there's a balance in my programming of original works for winds, works from living composers, but not turning our back on those great cornerstones of our repertoire as well, from composers who just don't happen to still be breathing, at the moment.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the challenge, isn't it?
It really is. Yep.
So I think there's a lot of concern now about the future, and maybe this is something that's been persistent for the last couple of decades, but there's a lot of concern about the future of music education. What challenges do you think we're facing, and what can we do to meet them, at least in your estimation?
Yeah, I mean, we are facing challenges. In some ways, I feel like we've always been facing challenges. As you study the development of bands and ensembles and music education in our country, you can see that there's an ebb and flow. And I think we're definitely going through another period of evolution at the moment. And this is brought on in part because of what is going on with music in general. We're finding, smaller audiences for orchestra and for band concerts. We're finding, a greater interest in popular music that is produced by very small ensembles, much of which is produced electronically these days. We do have shifting tastes in our culture. I'm just trying to think of the best way to answer this. I remember when I came into the Marine Band in the 1980s that we were concerned because our audiences were so old. There was so much white hair out in our audiences. So we thought, who's going to be coming to our concerts in 20 years? Who's going to be there? Well, you go to a Marine Band concert now, and it looks very much like it did in 1980. And it's not because those people are still alive. It's because there's been, generations that have come along and have perhaps developed a greater interest in coming to band and orchestra concerts as they've gotten older. So I think some of this may resolve itself, but I do think that in music education, I'm sensing that there is a shifting interest toward those smaller ensembles, toward popular music, shifting away from the large ensemble experience. And that really does concern me, because as much as I love popular music, you'll find many, pop, rock, country CDs in my own collection. I love to listen to that music. That experience is not the same as playing in a large ensemble. And I think that that is something that we need to continue to impart to people who really want to kind of take apart our current music education system and shift the focus away from the large ensemble experience. But it's going to take a multi-pronged effort. It's going to require that we try to keep our large ensembles as relevant as possible, finding composers that are writing music that people want to listen to, that bands want to play, that audiences want to come and pay music to listen to, and to but also to make sure that our administrations understand that in addition to the musical value of these experiences, there really are life lessons that our students learn. I've done a fair amount of study of leadership in the business world, as part of my previous career. And one of the things they stress all the time is team building, all these team building exercises that you'll find at these leadership training camps and classes. And I think, what better example is there than what we do as musicians, in terms of team building, of the need for leadership within sections, from principal players and section leaders. But ultimately, people working together, acquiescing toward this larger goal, in some cases, kind of checking their ego at the door and realizing that we need to collectively work for this ensemble to sound as great as it can possibly sound. We need to work together, following the leader on the podium, but also the leaders within the organization to achieve the highest possible goals. And I think, what a great model for the business world. So, the more that we can stress those kinds of life skills that musicians develop through playing in bands and orchestras in our education systems, that may help to, to preserve those traditions as well.
To me, band and orchestra and choir for kids is about the team building and the skills. And of course, music brings lots of things, but it's intrinsically valuable in and of itself.
Right.
But more than that, kids in those ensembles have a place to be. Mm-hmm. And it gives a sense of belonging. And to me, when people talk about wanting to get rid of the large ensembles, I think about those kids who have that as their sort of identity. And that makes me nervous.
It does, I think, when I see the success of marching bands, especially here in the Indianapolis area, Indiana, I'm really in the heart of that, tradition in many ways. And that's an experience I didn't have growing up in Northern Vermont. We really didn't have marching band, but I saw my kids went to school in Northern Virginia, and their high school had a great marching band, also had a great concert band, so the marching band provided them with a wonderful social network and a social experience. And they got a higher level of musical satisfaction out of the concert work that they did as well. But so, when I see, the drum corps and the marching bands and the success that they have, there's part of me that feels like musically, some of those experiences cause some degree of concern to me because I don't see as much emphasis on music. But when I see the attention that they bring to music making in general, when I see the quality of those social experiences they provide for their students, and again, those skills, those team building skills, and the desire to pursue excellence, I think there's really so much to be gained from those programs. So I think, I think it's all good. I think we just need to, make sure that we're exploring all of our options in terms of providing opportunities for our students that are musically satisfying, that do help them to develop these other skills that are going to be useful in their lives, and that we just make sure that there are no unexplored opportunities out there for us.
Yeah, So, Mike, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
Well, and it's funny, because I feel like in many ways I have been incredibly blessed. I feel like I've been hit by the lucky stick over and over and over again from my spouse and my family and my career, that things have worked themselves out. And I think my 20-year-old self, I think I would have said, keep working hard, but have faith that things will present themselves. I've been very fortunate in my life that at every critical juncture, what seems like the perfect scenario has presented itself. And the advice that I guess I would give my 20-year-old self, and the advice that I do give to other young people, is to work hard and be ready for those opportunities when they come along, because you never know when they're going to come, and you've got to be ready when they do come to take advantage of them. And so it's really, pursue those goals. My goal was to be, principal euphonium in the Marine Band. I achieved that goal. And I thought that was the end of the road for me. But little did I know at the time that there were all sorts of other things that could and would happen because I was, ready when the opportunity came. So I guess that would be it, is to, try to, to work hard, but not stress out, relax and realize your life will unfold before you. And just be ready to take those opportunities and ready to kind of follow the path. I really feel like a path has presented itself to me. And if I had fought that path, if I had not been willing to go down that path, I'm not sure, I may have had a very successful and happy career doing other things, but I really feel like I have just been following the path that has presented itself to me. And so far it's worked out.
So what's your favorite work for wind ensemble or band?
Oh gosh, I always have a hard time with those favorite questions. I guess, and this is one of the reasons that I teach it with my conducting students. It's pretty hard to beat Granger's Lincolnshire Posy just in terms of the scope of what he does within that 15 minutes of music. The variety, the amount of territory that he covers, it's all there, So if I had to pick one, it would be that. But honestly, ask me on another day and I'll give you another piece,
That's the runaway favorite, by the way. That's what most people are answering.
Sure.
It's a hard question. I'm thinking about rephrasing that to be maybe what's the last piece you'd like to conduct or perform?
Yeah, and that's a good one. That's a really fun one to conduct, I got to say. And again, because it's different every time, because you can really, because each movement really kind of reflects the personalities of those folk singers that Granger was trying to pay tribute to. The challenge and the reward is one and the same, and that is to keep it fresh, to keep it feeling like it's being sung or performed for the first time.
Do you ever want to program Stars and Stripes Forever?
Oh,
again?
I do. I'm doing it on the 4th of July. In fact, I'm conducting the Carmel Symphony Orchestra tomorrow night in a patriotic program. They needed they're between conductors right now. They asked me if I would do this, so I said, yeah, I'm familiar with that kind of programming. So I went through my Marine Band notes, and we're ending the concert with Stars and Stripes Forever.
I have to say, that's one of those pieces to me. That march, every time I hear it, I love it. I know some people don't like it, but I love that piece.
I don't know how you could dislike it, honestly, but I'm a little too close to the source. But, I did get that question a lot, didn't you ever get tired of playing the Stars and Stripes or the Marines hymn or the national anthem? And my answer to that question always was that, yes, I played those pieces, conducted those pieces thousands of times, but every time you do it, the energy that you feel coming from the audience is so positive and so enthusiastic, it does breathe new life into those works. And that's the key. If you can kind of get out of your own head and realize what this piece sounds like to that person out there in the audience, especially with the Marine Band on tour. My gosh, we play Stars and Stripes and the Marines hymn. Do the Marines hymn, and you'd see this grizzled old World War II veteran, in a wheelchair, struggling to his feet because he couldn't bear hearing his Marines hymn without standing at attention. I mean, how does that not touch your heart?
Yeah, that's something.
And it just makes you realize the power of music. It's just incredible.
Yeah. Sometimes we forget about the audience in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, well, in fact, with the Marine Band, we'd go on tour, and oftentimes we would play beautiful concert halls, the best concert halls in the country. But other times we'd be playing in a community where the only venue that would work was a high school gymnasium, and it would be brightly lit because that's the way gyms are, But oftentimes the band members would say their favorite tour memories came from those experiences because they could see the audience, In those beautiful halls, it's a dark auditorium. There could be nobody out there, but when we're in those experiences in the high school gym with the local Marine Corps League or VFW, in the front row of the audience, and we could see firsthand just how much this music moved them, it was really special.
Okay, so Mike, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, probably the easiest way is through our Butler University website. I'm listed, of course, with the faculty, both as the conducting faculty and with the brass faculty. So just go there. mcolburn@butler.edu is the email address. But again, you can find that on the website. That's probably the best bet.
All right. Is there anything coming up you'd like to share?
Nothing in particular. As I said, I'm doing the Carmel Symphony Orchestra on the 4th of July, but I'm not sure any of your listeners are going to have time to catch that performance. But no, I mean, I hope you'll check out, your listeners will check out the Butler University website to see what we're doing with our wind ensemble. We're doing some interesting programming, and of course, if they have any questions about band or euphonium, they can always drop me a line.
Mike, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you very much for being interested in talking to me.
Oh, of course, and I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Take care.